Every time you want to say something in Spanish, you first have to think of the word in English and then do a mental translation, and I'm sure you feel that it slows you down. I'm Alejandro from KeySpanish, and today I'm going to share with you the secret to stop translating in your head and start thinking in Spanish. But first, let's clear up some misconceptions. Some people seem to think that we have our English brain and then our Spanish brain, and it's a matter of just calling upon our Spanish brain, and this way we don't translate and we think directly in Spanish. But that's not the case. We simply store language in particular regions of the brain, and we build up with time certain associations. For example, if you're learning the word for brain in Spanish, you will learn that is cerebro. And this cerebro maybe makes you think of the word celebración, celebrar, celebro in Spanish, which is to celebrate. And celebración maybe makes you think maybe of a party, una fiesta in Spanish. So you start building these connections and building out meaning as you learn new words and new concepts. And this process of learning new words, new things through certain associations and decoding meaning is quite a complex process and requires a lot of cognitive power. And it is done by our short-term or working memory. And to make my point, and before I tell you the secret to start thinking in Spanish, we need to do a short test. I'm going to tell you 5 words, and you need to try to remember them. Okay, ready? Football, baseball, tennis, voleibol, golf. Okay, how many of these 5 words can you remember? How many can you remember? I'm sure quite a few of them, maybe even all of them. But now let's try with a different set of words. Hipiar, arrebol, joyel, melifluo, púas. Right? Let's see, how many of these 5 words can you remember? This time, maybe you were able to remember 1, 2, maybe 3 of them, but probably not more. So what happened? The first 5 words are probably familiar to you in Spanish because they are very similar to the English words, like football, baseball, tennis, volleyball, golf. And also, all of them share a semantic category. All of them are sports. And they also share the morphology. All of them are nouns. But the second set of words are different categories of meaning. They are very infrequent words, uncommon. They are not similar to the English words, and they are different in morphology, where some of them are nouns, some of them are verbs. So as you have probably just experienced firsthand, our working memory is very limited. When it comes to unfamiliar terms, it can hold 3 to 4 items of information, and it can hold them just for a very short period of time. We start forgetting them after 3 or 4 seconds. So imagine when learning a new language is very hard. There are many words you don't know, and creating these associations, decoding meaning, and remembering just with your working memory, it's very, very, very difficult. As you have probably just experienced firsthand, our working memory is quite limited. It can hold up to 3 or 4 items of new or unfamiliar information at the same time. And it also forgets quite quickly. After 3 or 4 seconds already, the information starts to fade. So imagine when learning a new language, there are so many unfamiliar words, unfamiliar structures, even unfamiliar sounds that you need to process. And that is very, very demanding. So that brings me to the main point here, which is why would you mentally translate all the time? What's the reason behind doing that? Well, Richard Kern from the University of California, Berkeley did some research and studied the role of mental translation on language learners. And the point is that we move the heavy processing of decoding meaning in a new language from our working memory to our long-term memory, which is where our mother tongue is stored, and the neural activity is obviously more active because we have been speaking that language for a long time. Therefore, when you are learning a new language, mental translation is actually helpful. It's what allows you to have the cognitive space to decode an amount of new words and meaning that you can handle. However, is that something you are going to do forever? Fortunately not. There have been studies on the brains of bilingual people, and they have seen that they use different neural pathways to access each of the languages. And what they are doing is to suppress one of the languages to call upon the other, to activate the other. You can think of it as having one bucket where you have your English and your Spanish, and then you are suppressing one of them. However, this process of directly accessing one language while suppressing the other requires quite a bit of activation from both of them. And when you are starting to learn, most of your neural pathways of your connections in the brain are obviously from your mother tongue, from maybe English. And as you practice more and more, then you are adding more Spanish to the brain, more neural pathways, neural connections, more associations. And you practice more, and eventually you will be able to call upon your Spanish and suppress your English as you build fluency. Which finally brings us to the secret to stop translating in your head and start thinking in Spanish. And the secret is patience. Patience. You just need to keep practicing, keep building your fluency, keep making your Spanish more active, and being patient. And eventually, you will start avoiding this mental translation. You will be able to suppress your English in favor of your Spanish. And that's what some other research supports too. There was a study of students of a second language in a school, and they measured the mental translation that they did, and it decreased by almost 40% after 15 weeks of studying with nothing special, no particular techniques or anything. Just by building the language, mental translation decreased over time. But before you click off the video, there is some advice I can offer you. There are some things that you can avoid and some things that help when it comes to avoiding some of the translation that's going on in your head. But keep in mind, the only secret is patience. So things you have to avoid is word-for-word literal translations and looking for logical explanations all the time in your new language, in Spanish. Let's see an example of why you want to avoid word-for-word translation. Let's imagine that you want to know how to say education in Spanish. In that case, it's because you have not watched my video on cognates, because you will know that most words ending in tion in English are just ción in Spanish. So education is educación. And maybe you want to know how to say educated. And you know that is educado. So educated would be educado. However, let's imagine now that you want to say that someone is a highly educated person. So you would say, well, es una persona muy educada. However, you need to be careful because in this context, you are saying that the person is polite, has good manners. And that's not probably what you want to say. You want to say, es una persona muy culta, o muy formada, o instruida. In this context, educated would be culta rather than educada. And translations can also give problems when trying to decode a sentence word by word. So you may want to say, I stopped smoking 5 years ago, and you are literally translating paré because stop could be parar, and smoking, fumando, ago, you maybe have learned that is atrás. So paré fumando 5 años atrás. I would understand what you want to say, but that's far from the way you would say it in Spanish. You would say something completely different. You would say, dejé de fumar hace 5 años. This is a sentence you would never come up to if you were to literally translate. So avoid translating just isolated words, and when you have a sentence, translating that sentence word for word. That's not an efficient way of doing it. Try to, if you are translating, at least translate full sentences. And maybe another good skill is to paraphrase. So if you don't know a particular word, instead of constantly looking for the translation, try to say a sentence in a different way. And now let's look at the second thing to avoid, which are logical explanations to everything. Let's take the sentence, me duele la cabeza in Spanish. Again, if you were to literally translate this, would be the head hurts me. This structure can be very confusing for many English speakers, and they tend to ask, why can I say mi cabeza duele? My head hurts, because they are thinking the way English works and the way English structures sentences. Another example would be a sentence like, le dije a María que no iría a la fiesta. I told Maria I wouldn't go to the party. If you are familiar with indirect object pronouns and you are more advanced, and you may be wondering, okay, why do we need to say le in le dije a María? Well, we already know that is a María. And this kind of questioning and looking for the logic every time from the perspective of your mother tongue and why things aren't the way they are in English, the way you are used to, is only slowing you down. And sometimes there's not even a logical explanation. Like in English, you say to make your bed and to do the laundry. This, for us Spanish speaker, is quite confusing because we say hacer la cama and hacer la colada. We use the same verb for both actions. So imagine I ask you, why I cannot say do your bed and make the laundry? I'm quite sure you will be having a hard time to give me a logical explanation to why this is the way it is. It is just the way it is, the way you express this concept in English. So just understand that different languages express things in different ways and appreciate that as one of the most beautiful things, one of the most beautiful aspects of learning a new language. You are learning a new way of seeing the world, a new way of communicating, instead of obsessing over the logic of why it is or why it cannot be in a certain other way. We have covered the two main things you should avoid if you want to reduce the amount of mental translation that you are doing. First, avoid word-for-word translation. And second, don't look for logical explanations to everything. Focus on learning the patterns and appreciate the new language is giving you a new way of looking at the world. And now, let's move to things that help. And let's separate these steps in steps that a beginner can take and steps better suited for intermediate learners. For beginners, the first thing I would recommend is to try to learn in chunks. What are chunks? They are a way of grouping words of information in a way that's more helpful. For example, if I ask you to remember this sequence of words and of letters and numbers, you may be having a hard time. But if we chunk them in this way, M16, 007, KGB, CIA, I'm sure these are much easier to remember. You organize them, you group them in a much more helpful manner. And that's something we do a lot in language. And we are going to share 3 specific ways in which you can learn with chunks. The first is with certain fixed expressions. These expressions that they are the way they are. And I'm sure you are already familiar with many of them. Just to give you some examples. ¿Qué tal? How are you? Or tengo ganas de, is to be looking forward. I'm looking forward to something. Or mucho gusto, pleasure meeting you. So these are examples of expressions that you cannot separate really. You have to learn them together, because if you take the words individually, they wouldn't have much sense at all. And the second thing you can do, apart from fixed expressions, is to learn collocations. So imagine you are learning the word caja. Caja is a box. So collocations would be frequent words that go together with this new word. An example, caja can also be una caja de cambios o una caja de herramientas. An excellent website to check for these kind of collocations or combinations would be SpanishDictionary.com. So you can see caja and gives you the meaning, but if you scroll down, you will see here lots of collocations and combinations. Like, for example, la caja de cambios, gearbox. And another site I really like is Yedra.es, and it gives you a definition in Spanish, but if you scroll down again, it will show you the words that come before and after more frequently. And that gives us interesting insights. For example, the most frequent word that comes after caja is fuerte, caja fuerte, or also caja registradora, which gives us more chunks or more groups of words to learn together. Caja registradora, caja fuerte, cash register, or a safe would be una caja fuerte. And after the fixed expressions and these collocations, the third and last way in which chunking is helpful is to learn the prepositions that go along with verbs. So for example, when you say casarse, you say casarse con alguien, casarse con Juan. Disfrutar, casarse will be to marry someone. Disfrutar is to enjoy, and you always say disfrutar de algo, to enjoy something. Disfrutar de la naturaleza, to enjoy nature. If you want to say that you trust someone, you confiar en el destino, or you trust something. I trust in destiny. So, confiar en alguien. So if you are reading, for example, a story, and you say you are reading that le gusta enterarse de las últimas noticias del día. She or he likes to find out, to be informed about the last news of the day. So every time you are learning a new verb, learn it alongside the preposition that it's used with. So enterarse de las últimas noticias, to find out about the latest news. As a beginner, chunking is the first step you can take to help you avoid literal translations and learning in a more natural way the language that is used. One more tip would be to use a monolingual dictionary instead of a bilingual one, and use images to help you. And for that, a very useful site would be wordreference.com. There is an option for Spanish to give you the definition instead of the translation. And you can see that if you look for the word caja, what we have seen before, it describes it as recipiente de varias formas y tamaños que sirve para albergar objetos. Now, if you are a beginner, looking for this kind of definition is tricky because there will be many words like albergar that you don't know. You can click on the word albergar and see it, but still can be tricky. So the good thing about word reference is that you have a direct link here that you can click and immediately get images from Google Images. So when you want to know the meaning of a new word, try first with the definition, monolingual dictionary, and if that doesn't work, you can click on the image link. Another useful site is diccionariofacil.org, easy dictionary, and you can here look up a word, caja, and it gives you a much more simple definition, and sometimes not always a picture. However, the amount of words in this dictionary is a bit limited. There are around 4,000. So word reference will be probably the best place to start. And very connected to this is to try to use image association whenever possible. So to learn the word caja instead of box, it is much better if you use pictures and images to learn it. And a way of doing that is using visual dictionaries. For example, the website superespañol.com has a visual dictionary with audio. There are different categories. This is good if you are a beginner because there won't be a lot of words, but the most basic ones will be there. For example, let's look at partes de la cara, parts of the face. And you can see that it has an image for every word and an audio. Unfortunately, it has a translation. I would prefer if you were able to hide this, but it is much better than looking at the translation directly. So you can use the pictures and the audio to learn new words instead of translating them. Other useful resources in this regard are books that you can buy from different publishers. For example, this Spanish English bilingual dictionary gives you lots of words and the translation too, but it prioritizes pictures. There is another one also called Spanish English Illustrated Dictionary with illustrations for vocabulary around certain topics. And the last step I'm going to recommend for you as a beginner is to don't use English subtitles. It's very tempting when you are starting to learn a new language, try to jump straight into the popular content, the things you have heard that are cool in Spanish, like La Casa de Papel, and because you don't understand anything or almost anything, you just watch it with English subtitles. That's fine for entertainment, but that's not a good habit because you are, even if you think you are learning Spanish through listening to it, it's unavoidable reading the subtitles in English constantly. So avoid doing that. And if you want to actually learn and improve, try to start with content you can understand. Like reading Spanish is an excellent source of comprehensible input for beginners and graded readers. I have discussed them in my video on how to read when you are a beginner in a foreign language or in Spanish, like Hola Lola. These are materials you can understand and you don't need to translate constantly. So as a beginner, remember to learn with chunks, verb with prepositions, fixed expressions, collocations. Also try to use imagery with visual dictionaries or illustrated dictionaries, and don't use English subtitles. Prioritize content you can understand. Now let's look at some steps you can take if you are an intermediate or more advanced learner. The first thing will be to consume media only in Spanish. All the series and movies you watch, the podcasts you listen to, the books you read, try to do that in Spanish. Immerse yourself, expose yourself to the language as much as possible. And more specifically, a very good opportunity is when you are learning a new topic. Let's say you want to learn gardening or about marketing, or you are looking up a new exercise routine. That learning, it's better if it happens directly in Spanish because you don't have a reference point in your mother tongue of that vocabulary. So it could be an excellent opportunity to do it directly in Spanish every time you learn something new. Also, you can change the language of your devices to Spanish, both on your phone and on your laptop. Good way of exposing yourself in real life situations. And the last one would be quite obvious to many of you, which is to travel and immerse yourself. There are many Spanish-speaking countries out there. Travel, be in the culture, but the key here is immerse yourself. So don't travel and go to McDonald's when you eat, book a hotel when the receptionist speaks perfect English, go to the most popular places, use the Uber app. This way you can live there and not interact at all in Spanish. Get out of your comfort zone. Try to book, for example, hotel that is more modest, or go to a place where there are not as many people that are likely to speak English, a more remote place. If you have to go to a restaurant, try to go to a local, a smaller one that you can ask around instead of looking on TripAdvisor. And when you are in the country, look for local groups on Facebook or Meetup to join native speakers that are doing certain things. So just to recap, remember that you don't have a Spanish brain and English brain that you can just force yourself to use your Spanish brain more. It is more complex than that. Your working memory is quite limited, and therefore meta translation is needed. The only way to avoid it and to be able to suppress one language in favor of the other is to have that language very active in your brain, which only comes with practice, 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 and therefore the secret, patience. However, there are things you can do, things you can avoid, to help you along this process, both for a beginner, as we have discussed, chunks, image association using monolingual dictionaries, don't use English subtitles, and as an intermediate learner, you can learn new topics in Spanish, consume media only in Spanish, and immerse yourself when you travel. So I hope this video was helpful. I know there are many people out there saying that you can stop translating in your head and thinking in Spanish, following some tricks and techniques, but that will only lead to frustration. That's not how it works. Just be patient, work on it, and it will come naturally. I hope you found the video helpful. If so, please give it a like, dale a me gusta, es gratis, it's free. And if you want to continue learning about how to improve your Spanish, you can watch the video I made about how to master vocabulary in 4 steps. Soy Alejandro de KeySpanish y nos vemos en clase.